Thanks, Patricia. Hello, everybody. I'm Debbie Fox. I'm with the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and I'm a part of the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium with Collaborative Solutions, the National Alliance for Safe Housing, and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our third and final Comparable Database webinar series here today with Collaborative Solutions and NNEDV from the consortium, highlighting the best practices that are happening in Texas with the Texas Council on Family Violence. On today's webinar, you'll be hearing from Molly Voiles and Alexandra Cantrell from the Texas Council on Family Violence, and Laura Shaw from Collaborative Solutions and myself will be fielding questions in the chat box during the webinar. The goal of the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium Comparable Database Series is to highlight what bubbles up from the field and to tell you what we are hearing and to share with you what's working. So there's no one-size-fits-all or perfect comparable database solution, and we encourage you all to take the ideas shared here today to inspire you and to keep you moving forward with creating or improving comparable databases and the data collection procedures in your communities and states for your HUD funding. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Molly and Alexandra from Texas to begin today's Comparable Database webinar.
Thanks, Debbie. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today to talk about some of our lessons when choosing a comparable database. We're really happy that NNEDV has been hosting this webinar series, and we hope that we can also provide some insight from our experience to help other states with this process. So the first thing that I wanted to do briefly is start with some introductions. So my name is Alexandra Cantrell, and I'm on the Programmatic Policy team at the Texas Council on Family Violence. You'll hear us refer to it as TCFV. And prior to my work with Texas Council on Family Violence, I worked briefly at a domestic violence clinic during law school, where I prepared restraining order applications for survivors of family violence. I practiced law briefly in both California and New York before moving to Texas, where I worked at the National Domestic Violence Hotline and a rural domestic violence agency before starting at TCFV. And I am joined here with Molly Voiles, who I will let introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Molly Voiles, and I'm also a colleague of Alexandra's here at the Texas Council on Family Violence on the policy team. I've had the privilege of working here for a number of years, but also working in HUD-funded domestic violence programs both here in Texas as well as in Indiana. So it's really exciting to be here and be a part of both that really important work that we know many of you are doing in your communities, as well as looking at it from the state level and how do we manage data when it comes to all of our funders, but certainly, of course, housing and urban development. We want to start by giving you just kind of a framework for our time today and tell you a little bit about the database issues present before we undertook our efforts here in Texas, as well as the assessments we made when we selected our database. We want to share a little bit about the ways in which we have worked to support database users, considerations we are taking related to coordinated entry, and then a lot about lessons learned from launching a comparable database. I think it was great that Debbie started off by saying no one size fits all, and certainly that's true here in Texas. And I would say in the 5 years we've been undertaking this work, we have learned quite a bit and still believe we have just as much more to learn about database work. For those of y'all who aren't familiar with Texas, when we're thinking about databases and comparable databases, it's important to think first about how large and diverse Texas is in the work of the Texas Council on Family Violence. We network with over 100 victim service providers in partnership with the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault, and we do so on issues around coordinated entry, comparable databases, data management, and funder and data elements. Some of these programs serve just one county, but they have a really dense population base. An example of that might be San Antonio. And then some have a few programs offering services in various corners of their city. And an example of that could be the Dallas Metroplex area. And then some serve just really large geographic areas with over 10 counties like the great programs up in North Texas. And so when you're thinking about a database or any other effort, you're thinking about how distinct and unique each of those family violence programs are and how do we support them. We also know that many of our programs sit along the Texas-Mexico border, which brings an additional dimension around service provision, or they may even sit on the Oklahoma-Texas border and be running programs, comparable databases through both states. So for us, we're always looking at those elements when we're thinking about databases, and like I said, really any effort here at the council. I get the luxury of giving a little bit of our history because I've been at the coalition for quite a while, and you'll see that image is not a joke about what our data reporting system looked like prior to our efforts. So before 2014 or so, we were just really aware that our family violence programs across the state and really our colleagues at rape crisis centers were struggling with the sheer volume of funder measures that needed to be reported. As with, I'm sure, in many of y'all's states, the family violence programs and rape crisis centers were often receiving 5 to 10 state and federal funding streams. And though I think funders try, even though they have measures that look remarkably similar, somehow they are all different. So they were struggling to think through how to collect the measures, provide really amazing supportive services to survivors, but also tell the story of the work they were doing. At the time, there was only one state system in Texas, and it really was actually just a reporting tool in its original design. It was used for our state funds and a couple of our federal funds, primarily our Family Violence Prevention and Services Act funds, or FVPSA. And it was a fairly old access database that many found confusing, like hard to use, and basically at times an antique. And so folks were required to utilize that reporting system, but it was quite difficult to use. It really only allowed for data collection for one funder, and certainly it was a primary funder and a great partner, but it really was only those state general revenue funds, our Family Violence Prevention and Services Act dollars, and one other federal funding stream. It did not include Victims of Crime Act funds, Violence Against Women Act funds, or other great funds that support sexual assault services. As a result of that, most programs are using at least 2 data collection tools, and that ranged from an Excel spreadsheet in the reporting tool to an Excel spreadsheet, a reporting tool, and the ALICE system, with data entry happening across all of those systems. Aside from the fact that that's just plain hard and cumbersome, it was taking away staff time from advocates being able to support survivors, and that's where we continue to see this trend in folks needing to report data and not having enough time to, and how do you balance that with the work you're there to do to support survivors. It also meant there was no comparable database available statewide, which, as folks on the call know, is a requirement through HUD for some of those really critical funds like emergency solutions grants, where those funds awarded through the continuum of care competition. So we really were at a place where we needed to assess what we were doing and think about where to go next. Right around that time, we were very lucky that our Victims of Crime Act funders saw the same need we were seeing and actually approached us and our colleagues at the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault, or TASA, with funds to support our efforts and to purchase a system for programs. With those funds, we looked for a system that supported both standalone domestic violence programs, standalone sexual assault centers, as well as programs that were offering both services. We also wanted the database to not just report for VOCA funds, but to look at the full breadth of need we had now become aware was an issue across communities, so to include a comparable database designation. So we really were looking for something that ideally would help all programs as well as all funding entities. For those of y'all who have done any work lately about looking for databases, you know that there are a lot of angles to think about. And so today, Alex and I are going to talk through some of these and as it relates to our selection and the way in which we've been rolling things out. The first, of course, is whether or not you decide to move forward with a cloud system or a system that is locally held. We're also going to talk a little bit about ease of use and technical assistance, as well as how much will this cost program, not just in the inception year, which of course is important, but looking down the road, one of the hardest parts about any database system is those first few years, so you don't want to be changing all the time, so it's important to be looking. We were, of course, again, lucky to have those funds, but it was also just a good stroke of timing on our end because we had been meeting with database vendors in the year prior because we were aware of the reporting systems issues and had been partnering with another funder to assess next steps. We had at that point looked at 4 different vendors and we had identified 2 more we wanted to see before making a decision. Their funding shift right about the same time the VOCA funding came available, so it was just great that we had already done some of that legwork to see a bunch of different vendors. And really, as you all have probably noted, almost all of the database models out there have great features. It's just whether or not it is the fit for you, the program, and the state you're in. For us, we're Texas. We like to be big, y'all. And so we needed someone who could offer the technical support for 100 providers. So if there was only, for example, 1 person on staff, that was potentially going to be an issue. So we ultimately chose 2 options because we also felt that not every program would likely pick the same system, and so our hope was to offer 2 options from those VOCA funds. Of course, we're going to talk today about the Osnium option. The other one we picked was Alice, but right as we picked it and we're about to launch the project, as many of you all are aware, that shifted to a different type. And so for most of the rest of the call, we're going to talk to you more about the use of Osnium being the main system here in Texas. So one of the first things you want to consider, and that we did as well, is whether or not the system would be cloud-based or locally held. Certainly, this is really important when you're looking at your Violence Against Women Act, your Victims of Crime Act, or your Family Violence Prevention and Services Act funds, because of those critical and important to survivors confidentiality requirements. The need to be able to protect identifying information at an agency meant asking a lot of questions around the cloud and who had access to it. We know in a prior webinar they did a really great job of talking through that, so we won't go over that today, but for us it was a huge piece we assessed. Because we did this in 2014, some of the more recent guidance that offers some clarity around the cloud was not available. And also some of the cloud vendors were not offering full answers to some of the questions we had asked at the time. Because of that, and we were not able to get all of the assurances we needed and wanted around security, we really felt like going for the locally held system would allow for programs to have the security necessary, as well as to own their own data and have that in-house so that they could run the data as they would like. So on our end, we did make the decision that we were looking for a locally held database. The next piece we looked at, and this one cannot be underscored, is ease of use. It's just really critical that when you're looking at a system, that you're not only looking at ease of use for you if you are the pass-through or you as the coalition, but most importantly, ease of use for the actual family violence program who will be using that. On our end, that meant making sure that programs were familiar with things that are basic, such as the layout, and that making day-to-day changes was something that an advocate who had a basic proficiency on a computer could use, that customizing was something that an advocate could take on potentially on their own, and that problem solving had a level of ease for folks using it. When we looked across our databases, that was one of the most important factors, and we felt that Osnium, because it was based out of kind of a Word format, would have a natural fit with most of the users. And as we had tested a number of databases, it was the easiest to use on our end. So we had the benefit of having looked at 6 or 7. I'm going to pass it to Alex to walk us through a couple of the other factors.
Great. So the next factor that we're going to talk about is the aspect of technical assistance, which we're going to get into in much more detail throughout the webinar because it is so very important. But this piece is really just going to be talking about how readily available it is through the software developer. So while we planned to provide technical assistance to agencies who are using Osnium, we also wanted to understand the size of Osnium support staff as well for those more technical questions that maybe we wouldn't be the best folks to be answering. So as a coalition, as Molly said, with approximately 100 member agencies, it was really important that we had a software company who had the infrastructure to support thousands of users. So a software company that only had one IT person would have been much harder of a sell for a state the size of Texas. And this also would have changed if we weren't planning or didn't have the capacity to be providing technical assistance to supplement that technical assistance provided by the software developer. So that's why those things are just so important to keep in mind. Additionally, TCFV thought through that initial learning curve period and decided to contract with Osnium to provide a series of trainings prior to the rollout of Osnium in Texas that were both in-person and recorded, and folks would have the ability to look back at those trainings throughout this process. So when additional agencies came on, there was still some sort of resource for them to go back and look back to. The next factor that I'm going to talk about is what the overall and yearly costs would be to programs. So we know that databases can be expensive, and that was a very important aspect for us to look into. So some things to consider when assessing cost of a database are cost per user, a yearly support fee, and whether or not those yearly support fees increase or have the ability to increase, customization charges, data migration charges, and license fees. Fortunately for us, due to the size of Texas, we were able to have a conversation with Osnium for them to offer a one-time license fee that was a bit lower based on the volume of programs that we had that were going to be utilizing the system. But additionally, based on how large some programs in Texas are, some programs have a staff of up to 400 people, it was really important that we had either a minimal user fee or none at all. And fortunately with Osnium, they do not have a specific user fee per user at an agency. We also were able to talk with Osnium about those yearly support fees and get them under $800 per agency. And we locked in a reduced amount with very modest increases per year based on the amount of users that were using the system, and so that all those agencies could budget in advance. One thing that we have to point out is that we had very gracious support from our Victims of Crime Act, our VOCA funder that Molly had mentioned, and that was allowing us to implement this new database and rollout process. So the VOCA funder had identified that agencies were using that old antiquated database or using multiple databases in order to meet their reporting needs, and they wanted to help in finding a database that would meet all of those agency needs without requiring double entry of data or slow processing on an old system. So again, we can't reiterate the assistance when it came to that funding piece and how important that was with the whole rollout of this database across the state of Texas. The actual rollout process required a lot of planning and constant technical assistance, and that resulted in a lot of key lessons that we learned that we'll get into a little bit later. As I mentioned, we were lucky to have the funding support, but the rollout process also required a lot of coordination with the software developer throughout all the stages of the rollout.
We also felt, because this project really rose up from advocates across the state telling us there was an issue, we wanted to make sure that as we designed our system, it was from the ground up rather than at the coalition level. We believed that advocates should be the ones designing the system and that they held the best expertise. So this included an outreach process where we linked up with very specific agencies. We wanted to make sure we were having a representative group across our state around program types. We know everyone receives different funding. So for example, the funds the Rape Crisis Center receives and the funds the Domestic Violence Center receives are quite different. And so we made sure that when we developed what we called the pilot group, that we had every program type as well as different areas of our state and the different contracts people may hold with our major anti-violence funders. This allowed us to have a group that had folks who may be knowledgeable in one area. For example, we had someone who was quite familiar around Violence Against Women Act funds, whereas somebody else may be very familiar with Victims of Crime Act funds, and in developing the system could represent those pieces. These agencies were the pilot group, and they developed, advised, and put into all the measures as well as the look of our system. So even starting on the very first call where they picked the layout they would like, that was all done through this pilot group. Not only was their feedback really important in creating the system, it was also really helpful because they were the folks who often tested reports, tested functionality, reported to us when things may or may not have been working. And then now, many years later, they are often serving as peer mentors for other new users of the system because they had a bit more time to get familiar and also were identified for the pilot partially because they were familiar with data measures. This group met frequently during the inception period, sometimes as frequently as every 2 weeks, and this went on for quite a long time. The reason we did that was that each change led to another change, which led to another change, and we felt that we wanted to stay true to the ethic that the system should be designed from the ground up at all points.
Another important thing that we were thinking about during the new database rollout is making sure that there is a lot of open communication between the coalition and the agencies that are beginning to use the new database. And I think that really started with what Molly was talking about, those pilot programs that were already giving us that really great feedback. But it was also super important for us to be talking to those agencies who maybe didn't have as much of an understanding or background with the system when we started to roll out to other agencies in Texas. We really wanted to let folks know in advance certain key dates, what was expected of them, and really making sure we were all on the same page when it came to that rollout. There are a lot of moving pieces when it comes to the rollout of a new database, and so keeping that communication open is just so important. A few other things to remember relate specifically to that agency feedback and being able to understand when difficulties or frustrations arise. So using a new database can be an overwhelming process, and we know that. It can be a very, very steep learning curve, especially when you've been so used to another system for quite some time. And so it was important to hear those frustrations and roadblocks with an open mind and a focus on how to avoid those feelings and those issues in the future. Some of the best resources and system updates that we were able to implement were typically based on agency feedback. Then finally, one of the most important things about the rollout process relates to a topic that we've spoken about throughout the webinar so far, and we're going to get into a lot of detail about it toward the end, and that is technical assistance. Without a dedication of time spent to understanding the system and accurately being able to answer questions that arose, that rollout process would have looked a lot different. So I don't want to get into too much detail relating to the technical assistance aspect because we're going to be spending more time on it, but I cannot emphasize its importance enough. And so with that, we're going to go to the comparable database considerations.
So we knew coming into this, like I said at the beginning, that along with our major anti-violence funders, that in our state, one of the things that was desperately needed was a comparable database. And so we made sure to think through how do we have a system that's designated as comparable, but also makes sense within the context of domestic violence. And so for those of you on the call who work with grants such as emergency solutions grants or continuum of care funds, you're likely very familiar that it must have all of the data elements to be designated. But what we thought through was that how we design it is really up to us. And so some of the questions that the HUD, kind of the different HUD funding types have, can be hard to ask survivors who are fleeing domestic violence and experiencing trauma currently. We did know they needed to be in the system, but what we did was spend quite a bit of time looking at each of the separate HUD grants and identifying those that would be likely to be received by a rape crisis center or domestic violence program, and frankly those that may not. We knew that we would not pull out those funding streams, but we thought we could make the organization of the HUD page make a little more sense for those users, and to pull out those questions that may be a little harder to ask if they didn't need to be asked. So we made sure everything was in there, but we created separate tabs because we found that one of the grants that had a lot of the more detailed questions was not a grant that was most commonly received by programs here in Texas. And when we finally asked a number of programs, none of them were receiving those funds. And so we were able to take those questions and create a separate tab. That allowed for us to continue to have the comparable database designation, but also, frankly, just promote the user entry, not having questions that folks aren't able to answer or not needed to answer, or that may be a little bit harder to ask a survivor at the time of intake and receiving services. We also made sure to put safety prompts in place. As many folks on the call know, there are certain measures that you do need in your system to be a comparable database, but we wanted to keep in mind with our holistic view on survivor safety. So an example is your social security field in the HUD system. Certainly it needs to be in there for the designation, but we placed what we call a soft warning about being mindful of collecting a detail of that type for survivors. It was a pretty general warning. We wanted to make sure we weren't stepping on either side of it, but we did want folks to be thoughtful about what they were collecting, particularly because some of those measures would never be offered when you're reporting through the continuum of care process. We also made sure that as the system was rolling out that we were supporting family violence programs and continuum of care HMIS leads when needed about the designation. This included putting together a document with screenshots of all applicable screens. In some instances, when we were already going to be in a city or town, we offered demonstrations on the system so that continuums of care could kind of do a checklist to make sure it was comparable. As you all know, it's that continuum of care that designates it as comparable, so we were just wanting to stand in support of all of the programs being able to make those designations. As you all know, and you'll see on the screen, you probably have these memorized, but it is a requirement that there be a comparable database, and so just as a framework, this is the HUD Exchange place that has it. I'm sure everyone has it memorized anyway, but that's what we were working towards here in Texas, was that more streamlined, comparable database. So before we turn it over to how we're doing technical assistance now, we like to be really honest about where we have failed and where we have succeeded, and we hope others can learn from this. One of the first things we would say is just absolutely critical in a database rollout is you will need someone who knows funder regulations. Having someone who is comfortable with technology is certainly a huge bonus, but if you're not familiar with the funder regulations and the way they're reported in your state, it will be quite a difficult undertaking to create a system. For us, a lot of time was spent memorizing and synthesizing those regulations, looking for ways we could streamline questions within the system so that if one funder asked for something, we had it for all of them. But I think when you think database, your mind doesn't immediately go to memorizing all of those funder elements, but certainly we wish we had a fairly decent understanding of it beforehand, and then you realize how much of an understanding you need to do database work. That was not only true around the anti-violence funders, but of course with the HUD funds, it's a huge piece to take on and feel that you have to a level of understanding, and even as we did, to be able to organize tabs based on those data elements. We also really wish we had done more beta testing. We would encourage anyone listening, thinking about rolling out, to do as much beta testing as possible. We did a little bit, so it's not to say there was none, but we wish we had more time, or maybe we had a rollout that was phased. With 5 or 6 programs going on, we essentially went live with 90 programs in one day. And obviously you all can probably understand the scope of technical assistance needed on something like that, and just issues that arise with any database. It certainly would have been much easier to have done that in waves. We also didn't, we do now, but we needed to have realized beforehand the importance of reporting deadlines and fiscal years. When you're starting a new system, as y'all know, most funders have a day at which someone is, quote, new. And often that is the day they enter service or the day of the first fiscal year. And so you don't usually want to start a new database in the middle of a fiscal year, because it can cause inaccurate reporting at the state level, where all of a sudden on the day the system goes live, everybody is new. Luckily, we were able to calibrate for that in ours, but it did require some programs entering some back data, as well as staggering out the start date a little bit later than we had originally thought we wanted to do it. Those reporting deadlines and fiscal years are just really important. You also don't want to start a new database right before a reporting deadline, because running a new database is hard enough, and then having a reporting deadline upcoming. For us, we definitely, some programs did decide to migrate data. It was a huge consideration for us of whether or not to bring in old data from frankly, a system we knew, as we mentioned earlier, was old and antiquated and knew it had some imperfections. And each program was able to make that decision on their own. The benefit of putting in and migrating data is that you could start in the middle of a fiscal year potentially. You would not have that same issue. The downside was your importing data, may not be all your best data, and it also means it's coming from a different system. So sometimes we use the analogy that it's like those toys that children have where you're putting shapes, but instead of putting the triangle in the triangle, you are putting it in the star and just pushing really hard. And that can be what migrating data from one system to another looks like. Some of the other things, more things for you to consider is staff training. We had quite a bit of a time finding facilities with enough computers to support the training. Some folks do quite well with virtual trainings, and some folks really prefer that hands-on. And because this was becoming a reporting system for the entire state for all funders, we did host a number of in-person sessions that we found to be really important. We also think individual programs and those who are designing databases need to have considerations for whether or not the data will be entered by one person, or if they will be at an agency where multiple people are entering data. There are, of course, pros and cons to both of those, but it's something for folks to learn and think about. So I think in terms of the rollout, certainly if we're honest about our failures, part of it was more beta testing and really taking the time to work out those hiccups. The data migration, I think we had some hiccups there. Like I said, if you're putting something in a shape that doesn't fit, that means you're forcing it along. And then the biggest thing for any rollout process is to keep the door open. Folks will be pretty honest about what's working and what isn't, and it's just really important to not think of it as a critique of your effort, but more that they're still providing you input that will make the best system possible. And we've always tried to embrace that philosophy here and really encourage folks to complain to us when there's a problem. If we don't hear it, we are not able to take it and address it. And so we've spent quite a bit of time highlighting to people the importance of doing that.
And so as promised, we are going to get into some specifics relating to providing effective technical assistance to agencies using the database you choose. And of course, we're going to be speaking specifically about Osnium, but I think these can kind of go across the board in terms of effective technical assistance for a supported database. So we've found over the past 4 years or so that providing technical assistance requires a lot more than just answering questions when those questions arise. And so we're really excited to share with you some of the lessons we have learned throughout the way. So the first and most important aspect of providing effective technical assistance is being sure to keep in mind the confidentiality requirements that most victim service providers are obligated to comply with. And I know Molly had mentioned this already, but we know that under the Violence Against Women Act and the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, victim service providers have an obligation to protect personally identifying client information. And this is a large part of the reasons why victim service providers may not enter personally identifying information into HMIS and have to use a comparable database to collect client information for reporting. This also means that even when TCFV is providing technical assistance, it has been really important for us to support those obligations and figure out ways to provide assistance without ever accessing any client information. I'm being very clear with that to agencies that we're working with. So I'm going to walk you through some of the ways that we've found to provide assistance without ever having to connect to an agency's database. Because as we've mentioned, Osnium is a locally held database, so that's something that the programs have locally. The first thing that we did was make sure that the coalition held a test database. So the database that we have, it's held by a few TCFV staff members, and it's updated whenever a new Texas layout has been released. So that way, we have the same layout and the same reporting functions used by all of the Texas agencies that are using Osnium. We also had the entire policy staff spend a day or two entering fake data into the database to be used for testing and technical assistance. So this was really important to make sure that we had data to be able to recreate issues that were occurring with agencies and then find solutions. The test database is also super beneficial for any trainings, webinars, or webisodes to make sure that folks are able to walk through exactly what those steps are in any guidance without having access to any personally identifying client information. Another safeguard that was taken was creating de-identified reports. So the reports that have been created within the Texas version of Osnium can pull de-identified data or only aggregate numbers. And they've all been tested by TCFV to make sure that they're accurate. So this allows agencies to run reports and use all those numbers, those aggregate numbers, to report to funders or their board of directors or any local grantors while still complying with their FIPSA, VOCA, and VOCA confidentiality requirements. We've recently moved to more flexible reports, which give the agency running the reports even more flexibility when it comes to running aggregated reports. And then finally, when an agency is unable to correct an issue by following written technical assistance, we will connect with the agency remotely through a GoToMeeting platform so that we can walk them through the steps required to correct that issue. And so we'll just share our own test database and allow the agency to follow along in their own database without any third parties, including TCFV, from accessing any personally identifying client data. It can be extremely beneficial for an agency to be able to view exactly what steps they need to take rather than having to rely on screenshots or written instructions.
So because even though we do have a template that is statewide, programs are able to customize on their own. Most folks are using the template, but you are able to make your own changes. One of the things we learned really quickly is that we needed a point person. I uniquely learned that. I originally was working on the Osnium project, but as a policy staff person with a focus a bit more on data elements and HUD and housing models, it was quite an undertaking to do that in collaboration with my other efforts. And so we knew that to truly run this in the manner we wanted, we needed one dedicated point person. It can't be someone with multiple other roles who's just fitting it in. Each time we have talked, whether or not that's at the local level or that's at the state level, it's something of this size is quite hard to take on with your regular efforts. So we were really lucky about a bit after rollout to have Alexandra join us, and it has been a night and day shift in the way folks perceive their support level, their ability to use the system. So certainly it's huge for us to have that benefit here, and Alexandra's amazing at what she does. But really the end line is to make sure that advocates are still getting back to the business of doing advocacy work. And whenever Alexandra can easily help them with that, rather than them spending untold hours figuring something out, it's a huge benefit, not only to us, to the program, and at the end of the line, to a survivor who now has time with their advocate. So we really, having a point person is a critical part of the database effort, and we can't underscore enough that a lesson learned was not to just shoehorn it in with the rest of the work. I would like to think I did a great job, and I am sure, seeing what Alexandra is doing, you can see exactly what really can be done by someone who has that as a core function of their job. It also was great that Alexandra came in with the background, so having someone who maybe almost less is around the technical side, but is aware of confidentiality and privacy, can really uphold those standards when working, as well as the funder elements that I mentioned a bit back on the lessons learned. Obviously, you need some level of ease working with computer systems, but if you aren't familiar with those funder elements and the privacy concerns, it's quite hard to support a comparable database or a domestic violence program's efforts around this.
And so, as Molly mentioned, one of the most important things when it comes to technical assistance is going to be time. It's going to be the amount of time that can be dedicated to that technical assistance. So if you want to provide effective technical assistance, it really does require a certain level of coalition capacity. And whether that means a point person right off the bat or multiple staff that have the time to allot to technical assistance, that time piece is very important. So you'll want to think through how much time will need to be spent on technical assistance. So this question is really going to require how many staff members will acquire expertise on the database and will ultimately be able to provide that technical assistance. So it does take some time to get used to a database. Even with a bit of background in entering data into a database, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to right off the bat know how to answer technical assistance questions. So it's going to take some time to really look into the questions that are coming in and start playing around in the database to really determine how to fix those problems. It's also going to be necessary to determine how long it's going to take for the person on staff to be trained, like I'd mentioned, how long it's going to take for them to spend time using the database, and also what level of expertise you're really looking for that person. So we know that those running a database are going to need a certain type of technical assistance. And Molly had mentioned prior, but just to reiterate, in rolling out the Texas database, it was really important and clear that we had an understanding of funder regulations, that we were able to answer questions such as definitions of services, what things can count where, and then things that needed to be answered by the coalition rather than the software developer. So we know that these topics would be nearly impossible for a software developer to get up to speed on and maintain that knowledge as funder regulations changed. So again, that was a very important thing to keep in mind when it came to that role of the person providing technical assistance. Another question to ask will be how much time will need to be spent on creation of resources. So we've found that creating resources and providing those to agencies was really crucial in determining the capacity of your agency. I've found that the creation of resources has helped to save me time in the long run because a lot of the questions that I receive now only require a reference to an already created resource. So that's been really, really beneficial for my time in the long run. We also have a hub on our website that includes all of our Osnium-related resources, which is pretty frequently visited and utilized by a lot of new data staff members from agencies to get up to speed on the system. So for me, this is lessening the need that will need to be dedicated to training new data staff, and it allows some flexibility for agency staff to watch the webinars, review the resources, look through the tips when they have the time to do so rather than having to schedule time with me. Then finally, one more question to ask is how much time is going to be spent coordinating or collaborating with the software developer? So this question is really important, but hinges on how much customization the coalition ultimately wants to implement within the database. We made the decision to customize the database so that it can capture all those data measures for our state and federal funders, from which most of our agencies receive funds. This required a lot of customization, and it also meant that any time that there's a funder change or some sort of requirement change by a funder, then we have to go in and assess those changes, identify whether or not we're capturing the information that the funder is looking for, whether or not there's an easy way to pull that information out in a report form, and then providing those changes to Osnium and testing all of those changes once Osnium makes those changes. From that point, rolling it out to the agencies, we go back to that rollout process and all of that organization that's just so necessary and can happen occasionally if there are a lot of funder regulation changes. Additionally, when HUD reporting changes occur, we make sure to stay in communication with Osnium to ensure that those updates are being taken care of quickly. And we're also here to chat with programs who have any issues with those reporting functions or to connect them to Osnium if we need to. So you'll see on this slide some examples of the resources that have been created over the past few years. You'll see on the left-hand side there's a series that we called You Asked, We Answered, where we took some frequently asked questions and put them in a Q&A graphic form and sent them out to our data listserv weekly. And then on the right-hand side is an example of a quick tip, a graphic that used screenshots to provide some technical assistance that can be referred back to. So I'm sure you can see that some time is taken to create these graphics, and sometimes that can seem a little intensive, but they're also going to be available in the future to be sent out to other people who have the same question. So again, ultimately it's going to be saving some time in the long run. And as a quick aside, there have been a few times that I've spoken with agencies that mentioned that they save all the graphics that have been sent out and refer back to them. And it was very exciting to hear that they were finding value in these resources. So I have a webisode, and I don't know that I'm going to be able to play it right off of here. I was going to give you a moment to see if you could just watch a few minutes of the webisode. But it looks like I won't be able to today, but I can explain a little bit about the webisodes and webinars that we've created to cover some questions about the Osnium system. So the webisodes that we have are typically 2 to 7 minutes. They're videos that cover one topic and can easily be referenced when someone asks that topic or that question again. And so I've found that while I really enjoy creating the webisodes and editing them, it can take some time to do that. But ultimately, I've been able to refer back to them so many times that, like I said, that time that's being spent initially is really you're getting that back based on the fact that you're not having to answer those specific questions. You're able to just reference that webisode or that webinar. And like I'd also mentioned, the webinars that we create are really helpful for new data staff, so people that are being hired onto an agency, to watch before they really get into that data entry process. And it's just something easy to reference back to or provide to new data staff. So a lot of the actual webisode, they're pretty straightforward, but we've definitely found that the ability to walk through these particular instructions and see them laid out are really beneficial and valuable for agency staff who are using the Osnium system.
So as Alex outlined, some of the pieces we learned, and one of the main reasons we were really excited to have Alexandra join us is that we knew that in many instances we had created communities with certain positions. And one of my main goals had been, how do we take this really amazing group of folks and create a community? Data advocates often have one of the hardest jobs. They're really having to say, hey, where are my forms? We got to get this in. They stand in a pressure position between grant reporting and survivor services. And so one of the big pieces we wanted to put in place was creating a sense of community for these really hardworking folks across our state who don't typically have the benefit of attending conferences and other pieces, mainly because of funding of their positions. So one of the things we did is we actually started a listserv, and Alex mentioned it briefly, but that listserv originally was mainly focused at data. It's now grown into much broader, and it's really covers all angles around programmatic policy, and is now, I think, our largest listserv here at the Coalition, or close to it, at over 300 advocates across our state. It allows for them, one, to receive updates and information for us, but almost way more importantly, they bounce ideas off each other. We will frequently, at least once a week, see someone send out a message saying, hey, do y'all know where this is? And it can range from something in the data system to a policy they're looking for. But it's taken those positions that are data, program policy, compliance, and offered a community. One of the things we also learned at Rollout is there is nothing, except for this webinar today, y'all, there's nothing worse than an hour-and-a-half webinar on data from a data system perspective. Obviously, today everybody's with us. But to spend a full hour-and-a-half dedicated at looking at various parts of the system is just really hard. And so we knew we wanted to offer those 3 to 5 minute videos Alex mentioned called Webisodes, because building skills is often in that time frame, and it allows you a finite thing to accomplish and offers that sense of accomplishment. So we looked holistically when Alex came on and even before, and then Alex and I together, and then Alex went around all the time at how can we create mediums that are more accessible. So you noticed on those sheets, she does spend quite a bit of time on the layout, and we feel like that's really important because it makes it so much easier to read and take in such a technical piece of information. And then we continue to produce new and up-to-date resources. We look at our old resources and pull them down when they're no longer relevant. And then one of the great things Alexandra has carved time to do is space to create a resource really quickly when there's a desperate need. So an example can be a funder decides a month before it's due to change a data element. You may not have time to tweak every part of the system, but if Alexandra can put together an easy-to-use resource on how to pull it out really quickly, then that's available. And then the other pieces that we've seen be really important, we started what we called office hours a while back, and that's the idea that some folks will reach out proactively, but some folks wait for space to be available, and so holding office hours virtually with sign-up slots allowed folks one-on-one time with Alexandra or the point person, and every single time we put those up, those slots were taken very quickly. We also host yearly scan calls to just see where folks are at, hear where things are, and Alex will talk a little bit about those results down the line. But really, we wanted to say to these really important people that there's a community as well, and how can we be a part of creating it and hearing about those resources that they need in creating a community for themselves. We also know that it's time to continue looking at how we're looking at databases and coordinated entry. And so one of the things we're putting in place in time for the start of our fiscal year is a new field for the assessment score in Osnium. We are not putting in all the assessment questions. We feel that that would be quite a bit to put on, potentially quite identifying and unneeded. However, simply the score that's often used in some of those workarounds to protect privacy felt important. And so in conjunction with some feedback from Continuum of Cares, we made sure to include that in our new update. We also continue to partner with Continuum of Care, and some of you may have been on a prior webinar we did with our great partners at the Balance Estate. We also look at other Continuums of Care here and just really being open to hearing what's needed to support coordinated entry within a database framework with a balance on supporting survivors' privacy rights at all times. And continuing to have those communication pieces that are necessary to fully support that. The other big piece for us is the idea that that it starts at the beginning, right? So the database is actually the end of the line. It shouldn't be the front of the line. And so if there's a data measure you are uncomfortable with or don't feel you would like to ask survivors, then we need to start talking to funders about those measures. And so we actually, as a part of this process, gained such a deep understanding of all the measures that we were lucky to partner and approach one of our main funders here in Texas and spend a year streamlining the measures and reducing them by 2/3 almost. So taking down all of those questions that were being asked of survivors that potentially felt really harmful for someone who was moving through trauma. And so working with funders to really realign those data measures. The other thing is if the database is the end of the line, what's the front of the line? And that's where you're getting that information that's going into a database and how is that being approached in a survivor-centered way. So we actually, a number of years ago, spent time interviewing 100 survivors, or actually quite a bit more, but a little over 100 survivors, and asking them, what would you like intake to look like? What would you like services to look like? What questions would you have liked to have been asked? What questions would you like to have not been asked? Are there any that felt particularly harmful or that you wished you hadn't needed to answer? From that, we were not only able to take that back to funders, but we created model paperwork that encompassed every required funder element, all the things survivors wanted, and we distilled it into a manual and a whole web portal with adaptable forms that programs could take and use. We also made sure at the end of the line to mirror the Osnium system so that folks would have paperwork they knew was survivor-led, survivor-driven, but also met all funder requirements. We also looked at key issues like trauma and literacy issues. We always try with our forms to address the kind of comprehensive understanding around literacy and making forms approachable. We also looked at where we were using terms that maybe felt friendly to us, but didn't make a ton of sense otherwise because they were coming out of funder measures. And then when we thought we had it, we took it back to survivors in both English and Spanish to hear where we had succeeded and where we had failed. And we're excited to hear where we failed so that we could retool. That's now available on our website in English, Spanish, Vietnamese, soon to be Arabic, and as fillable forms to support mobile advocacy. We believe that running the database includes that as well. Not everyone has to take that on. Certainly we're not saying that, but for us, we felt that we were looking at starting with survivors and ending with survivors, and that included that process.
So some additional and necessary steps that we continue to take and make sure we're staying up to date with are all of those HUD notices for HMIS and comparable databases. So we're, again, making sure that we're assessing those notices, that we're on those listservs, and so that we're making sure that we are having those conversations with Osnium to make sure that all of those updates are being made within the system. So we're also making sure that we're aware of any changes that occur with any HUD-related reporting, and that we are continuously able to run the necessary reports out of Osnium. So that way we can troubleshoot with any agency who's running into issues and make sure to find that solution or connect them with Osnium if we need to. And then finally, we just continue to provide support related to tech safety, related to confidentiality regulations when it comes to database and personally identifying client information, as well as really staying up to date on the topic of encryption. So to the lessons learned. As we've mentioned throughout the webinar, organization is just going to be so important, particularly when it comes to any type of rollout. So that means, that initial rollout of the database, but that also includes the rollout of a new layout, the rollout of a new reporting mechanism. Those are continuously going to be things that will require a lot of organization on your part and on our part. And for us, coordinating with almost 100 agencies and the software developer, takes a lot of organization and communication for that smooth implementation. And even with that, don't expect everything to be smooth sailing. We know that there are going to be issues that arise. It's of course not ideal, and we don't love it, but we know that it's going to happen. And you know, we've had some pushback from agencies who would have preferred to remain with their old database, but you know, made that ultimate decision to move to Osnium. And I think that there was some hesitance there, and we tried to be understanding of that because we know that it's very hard to move to a new database. We also know that agency staff typically do not get into this work to enter data, which is why I'm always really encouraging of agency staff to reach out to me or one of my colleagues for even the smallest question, because if I can save them some time and allow them to get back to providing those important services to survivors, then that is a success for us. So I try to be very clear with agencies because I think there is some hesitance in reaching out for a question that they feel is a small one. But I tell them that it's most likely that if they're asking this question, someone else has asked it as well, and I likely have an answer. Of course, I don't always have every answer, but I'd like to think that I'm able to save at least a little bit of time for those people who are really at their agency to provide those services that are so important to survivors. So I also wanted to add that while the learning curve is steep when working with a new database, and it may seem like a long road, we've really started to see some comfort and appreciation of the database. You know, there can be some feelings that it's, you know, never going to work out, that people are never going to like it. There's always going to be some, you know, issues that people are facing. But Molly had mentioned those yearly scan calls that we have, and I recently held one of our yearly calls, and I asked folks to vote on how they were feeling with the database now. And I think it was a pretty risky move because I did not have any idea how they were going to answer, but it turned out that over 90% of the people who polled felt really comfortable or much more comfortable with the Osnium system as compared to the 8% who weren't feeling very comfortable. So with the amount of time and resources that we've spent on technical assistance for the Osnium database, this result was very exciting for me to know that you know, people are feeling better with the system and utilizing it effectively and not always having to reach out for technical assistance. So all that to say that it may not always be an easy road when implementing a new database, but that frustration and pushback is not going to last forever. So I finally did want to make sure to mention how incredibly helpful it has been since Osnium became a part of the comparable database conference calls with HUD. This way we know that they're receiving the most up-to-date information and it's being relayed from HUD to our software developer. So we know that that has been extremely helpful in ensuring that those updates are being made timely. And I know that there was a question related to how long those changes take to be made, and I really think it depends on the particular update. You know, for example, I know that Osnium is always trying to make sure that those updates are made in the time that's necessary for that reporting, that first reporting deadline. So most recently for that SAGE update, they were sure to get that update made prior to that deadline. So where are we going next? We're keeping our eye on the cloud. I know Molly had mentioned that early on in the webinar and how there wasn't a lot of guidance prior related to cloud-based databases. But we also know that they can be extremely convenient for agencies who are doing more remote work or have a large amount of data to be stored. So we're continuing to try and think through the confidentiality implications relating to cloud-based databases. So that's one of the areas we're continuously looking and researching on. So we're definitely thinking about it. But we also continue to identify ways that we can support all database users in Texas. So not only those who are using Osnium, but those who've created their own database or are using a different system. We really want programs to feel like they can come to us with questions regardless of the system they are using. And I think that takes some outreach to really let people know that we're not just here to assist with Osnium questions, but we really want to help all programs in Texas regardless of the database that they're using. So some additional next steps, some other things that are coming up that we continue to keep our eye on is just continuing to develop those relationships with our continuum of cares. There are multiple continuum of cares across the state, and we have varying relationships with all of them. But we just want to make sure that we're keeping that communication open with them because we know that that's beneficial to the agencies that they're working with. We're also continuing and hoping to continue to interact with the Texas HMIS leads more frequently and building a stronger understanding of the HMIS system to be able to identify questions when they arise for the agencies who are using the comparable database. So as you can tell, the main next steps really include just continuing to communicate with all of our HUD partners to ensure that information is being adequately relayed to our Texas family violence and sexual assault agencies, and that they continue to be able to collect the necessary data and report as easy as possible when it comes to the HUD reporting requirements. And then finally, we would be remiss not to let you know and to identify a really amazing resource that I know I've frequented and that is really, really helpful because as we've mentioned, you know, one database is not right for everyone, and so really going through all of these specific pieces will be important when identifying what is best for your state or your agency. So we wanted to be sure to provide a link to the resource from the NNEDV Tech Safety website relating to selecting a database. So there are some great resources and information within that site that you can also use when selecting a database. And I think we do have some questions right now, but of course, you know, you can continue to send them in, but we'll just take a second to take a look.
We definitely encourage folks to ask questions. We know that we attempted to cover some of that, but we're really happy to be honest and share about all of the work we're doing. And I don't, maybe we are turning it over to Debbie or Laura to ask questions potentially.
Yeah, I think we would, I think we're going to go through the questions so far in the chat box that are there. You guys answered some of them. I think that one of the questions that came up is the model scalable, and then what's your TA that you provide to programs around sharing personal identifying information across programs or staff within the same agency?
Sure. I mean, in terms of scalable, and Alex chime in a moment, but we are Texas, y'all. It's quite large. So we do think the model could be used in many states, just given, I think we have 90 programs on it right now. And so I think the big piece around the test database was a dedication of time over the course of a week. It has paid back over and over that time. As Alex said, every member of the policy team entered about 5 hours worth of data to get roughly 50 to 100 clients now we have in there. So that piece. In terms of the biggest piece to consider is whether or not you have funds for a dedicated staff person. We can't say enough that the success of what we've got is based partially on that model. I think any database vendor is great at offering more technical assistance, but it's not reasonable to think they would know every state's funder elements, and that's where we saw disconnects. And so that part, I think, was really important. In terms of the personally identifying information, there is a feature within Osnium to have case notes locked. We have encouraged and trained on that. We have also, Alex and I uniquely are also the main trainers at the coalition on confidentiality, privilege, and privacy, and that's why we've always held so tight to not, to using the test database, and kind of if we're going to train on the model of privacy and privilege, then we need to also be implementing it. That said, you know, most federal confidentiality, and certainly our state victim advocate privilege, allows for individual staff to see it within the agency. So outside of the case notes, much of the information would be open to folks, but you can limit based on user role, and Alex can tell you a bit more about that.
Yeah, so I was just going to add, I agree with what Molly was mentioning, but additionally there are some abilities for each user, each login, to have a different privileges. So for example, if you have a volunteer who's coming in and only entering hotline calls, you can have a very specific user privilege for that individual where they don't have access to anything else in the system. And so you can also, on the other hand, have someone who is a staff person who has a privilege where they're able to see everything, but they're not able to delete services or a client profile. So there are a lot of customization capabilities when it comes to limiting or opening up what each user may be able to access within the system. And hopefully that answers your question, David.
And while we have Debbie and Laura chiming in a moment, we know there was a great question about whether or not this has function as a case management tool and how to collaborate with it. So it actually comes with a number of case management tools. We actually focus more on the reporting side. So when you look at the Texas version of Osnium, all of those case management functions could be employed, but our efforts have been more on that reporting side. Some of the programs have customized in those case management elements, but we have focused again more on that reporting comparable database side, and Alex can share a little bit more about how folks might be using those. There are schedulers, for example, and other pieces.
Yeah, I think in general, most folks are not really using the scheduler capability, but it is there, and we've had people who are interested in it and have gotten some information from Osnium, and I think that's another thing that we plan on looking into a little further because there does seem to be some value for some agencies to be able to use it as a scheduler, but we want to spend a little bit more time really looking into how that would work. But there is the capability within the system.
There's also a question on if agencies, if HUD has been satisfied, so your balance of state or whoever's turning in the CAPR and the APR, if they've been satisfied with the reports and it's working and that they're assured that the data that is needed is collected for the HUD funder.
So that's kind of a like, so yeah, yes, Alex will share that it's working quite well now. We honestly, and I think many folks did, when the CAPR shift happened, did we experience challenges? For sure we did. I think moving into that CSD element, honestly, the biggest problem was more that we had not been proactively alerted of the need to collect all those elements, and you can't report something you didn't collect. And so that was a piece where we quickly drafted and developed one of those client file resources we mentioned, and I had a supplemental form to the intake packet that helped quite a bit. And so in that way, part of it is, as technical assistants, letting folks know when there's new elements to capture or a shift. And then certainly that is one area where I think Osnium took a little bit longer to make that shift. But I think Alex can talk about since then. It's been going quite well. Are there ever issues with data quality? For sure. It's always difficult to ascertain how much of that is understanding the measures and how much of that is the reporting. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you know, I agree in the respect that, of course, when the CAPR first came out, it was a little tough. You know, I think that it took a little longer than we had hoped. There were some issues that arose. But I do think, and I correct me if I'm wrong, Molly, but I do believe that Osnium started on those conference calls around that time, and since then there has been a marked shift in how quickly they're making sure to make those updates and how accurately they're making the updates. So I can't emphasize enough that having those conversations with your software developer and making sure that they're on the same page as the funder, particularly when there are conference calls that are available for comparable databases, are really, really important, because I've seen a very, very large difference in how successful those new reporting mechanisms have been since Osnium has been part of those conference calls. So more recently, we have not seen the same types of issues as we saw initially.
So that would be a good plug then, Molly. I'll just say if anyone is working with a vendor that's a comparable database vendor that is not Osnium or EmpowerDB, they're on the monthly HUD vendor calls. But if you're working with any database vendors currently that are slow to make the HUD required changes and rollouts, you can connect with me at NNEDV, and I'm able to connect your vendor to the folks who run the HUD monthly vendor calls, so you can be up to speed and get the most timely information around HUD reporting.
Thanks, and I know somebody was asking about our model paperwork, and we'd be happy to share with you if you email us directly. You'll see in a moment we'll be giving our email, but feel free to email us, and either one of us can work to support that request. Thank you for asking.
It looks like we have another question around customization around reporting. So when you are asking Osnium to make updates around your various state or local whatever funding reports, how long does it typically take? What's the turnaround time for Osnium to update the reports?
So that's a great question, and I know I keep saying this, but it does really depend on what changes are being made. So in general, when a slight change is being made to some sort of report, it could potentially take 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the layout changes and the reporting changes, the testing, and then the ultimate push out to an agency. But it's really going to be determining based on how intensive those changes are. So we had a pretty large-scale reporting mechanism change recently that required a lot longer because the testing process itself was over a month long, just having to test with all those agencies and making sure before it was rolled out that it was accurate, it was pulling correctly, and there weren't going to be issues when that happened. I know that Molly had mentioned throughout that really staggering those testing timeframes can be really beneficial. And so when such a large-scale change is occurring, we try to make sure to do that, which does end up turning into a bit longer of a process. We try to give ourselves as much time as possible when it comes to changes to reports. But, Osnium has worked with us in the past when we have something that's a little bit quicker. We have like a shorter turnaround time. So I'm not saying that they would be opposed to that, but we tend to err on the side of a little longer than we anticipate, just based on the necessary testing that is required before we're pushing it out to 100 agencies.
So it looks like we're out of questions in the chat box, unless I've missed something. If there's any
last minute modifications, Debbie.
Oh, hi, Laura, go ahead.
Sorry. Risha has asked about modifications, and she said that you all mentioned something about modifications that you did with HUD for reporting, and she's wondering how any of the layout changes have impacted system use. So any of the customization that you've put in for your system, for your users, for your needs, has it impacted the use, made it better, made it worse?
So I would say that state template modifications generally made it better because we were able to really focus in on what folks would be reporting. And then because the layout mapping Alexandra does is based off of our template, it's made it quite easy to make those changes. If we're, being candid, where there is occasionally challenges, is if a local program has customized on top of that. When a new model file from us comes out, they have to have kept track of the changes they made, because there is the potential for the changes we made to overwrite those changes. And so folks do definitely need to keep a track record at the local level of changes they're making. At the state level, because Alexandra maps to the state model, it's not the same issue.
Okay. Thank you. Andrea has a question about when you were all customizing or building the design using advocates from the beginning and throughout. Did the pilot group include executive directors of programs? And if so, was there a target percentage of direct service staff versus administrators in your pilot group?
So yeah, that's a really, really great question. We looked for a balance. Certainly we wanted to go a little bit heavier on anyone in a position type that would know either databases or funder elements. Sometimes that was an executive director. More often that was data folks. Honestly, one of the greatest kind of helps to our work has been people who stand in the role of grant compliance. They often know the measures very well and are familiar with the database. So we have some just amazing folks and programs in Texas in those roles. And I do think all of the executive directors were aware and certainly supportive of their staff sitting in that role. I'd have to look at the list to give the exact percentage, but we were more focused on the expertise they brought. And so, like I said, we had, for example, a couple folks who were just really good at databases. We had 3 folks at least that were really grants compliance folks who really knew every single letter of those pieces, who maybe had started doing data but didn't originally come from data. And I do think we had a couple executive directors as well. So you really want to mix, and it's the expertise they bring, less those in the position.
And I see that there's one question relating to CSV exports or import capabilities. And so I can tell you that for all of our reports in Osnium, so those flexible reports that I've mentioned, there's the ability to export them in Excel, in CSV, in PDF. And so you are able to export or import those files in that way. So when you're running a report, changing that format. And also, our state level funder does require CSV level files, and we were able to create that reporting mechanism as well. So that was that larger scale reporting change that we made, but there was the capability to do that, and it seems to be working well at this point.
Thank you all for your great questions today.
And we would just say, I know there is a question about the difference between Osnium and ImparDB, and we won't speak to that. We will just say, even in Texas, there's programs here using a different database, so every single one of them, most of them bring something amazing with them. And so using that resource Alexandra mentioned from the Safety Net project at the National Network on Domestic Violence was so helpful to us. So we would strongly encourage folks, if you're making an assessment, to also use those tools.
And this is Debbie at NNEDV. Another thing I would add is, so far as we know, EmpowerADV and Osnium Women's Shelter are the zero knowledge encryption and the most secure of VOCA compliant comparable databases, but we're always looking for new resources. If people are using other databases, we'd love to know about it. And then we're always having in conversation with different software developers as they are developing their software and encouraging them to make it zero knowledge encrypted so we can share it with the field. But I just want to give the caveat that we're not sales folks or connected to the different software developers, and they can change overnight, like what was mentioned earlier when Alice went belly up and everyone kind of left wondering what to do next. So we have examples for the field and want to share with you what's working best, but we can't guarantee the solvability or like the software database companies will be around forever. They're the best because we're not a part of creating them, but we do want to encourage folks to have the software that is the most compliant with VOCA. Are there any other questions coming through, Laura?
There's one that was just asked about whether or not EmpowerDB is the only zero knowledge encryption. That's not correct, right, Debbie? Osnium is too.
The only web-based one currently, and then Osnium is locally housed on the local servers.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, so all the reports on our end are tested to ensure they're de-identified before being rolled out, so that's the way in which we're working to support that. And I would just underscore what Debbie's saying. I think we're not attempting to sell Osnium either, more, if anything, highlighting the technical assistance model, no matter what the database was what really helped us out. So thinking about the infrastructure in your program to support those efforts. Well, thank you all so much for spending time with us. You'll see on the screen both Alexandra and I's emails. We welcome questions, and if folks want access to the model file, please let us know. We really like hearing from folks who are working on this.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, everyone, for spending the time with us and listening to us talk about comparable databases. Such a fun topic.
Thank you for all your work, Molly and Alexandra. I know this is no small feat and many years of work, and I really appreciate you sharing all of your hard work with the field. And I just want to let everyone know that this webinar has been recorded, and the PowerPoint from today's webinar with you all with Texas, and then last week Iowa's webinar will be sent out to you all as well for your reference and to share with your colleagues. And then also the information, the webinar will be on the Safe Housing Partnerships website as well, so you can find it there, and then also additional resources on the intersection of DV and housing and homelessness. And then also, just for everyone's reference, we're going to be having 2 webinars this week, Wednesday and Thursday afternoon. There are 2 webinars on the HUD-NOFA process and how to apply for the DV Rapid Rehousing Set-Aside, so we also hope you join us for those webinars as well. And that's all. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you all. Take care.